Background before the tragedy. Monday morning, bustling streets of New York City, 1997. The city, alive with its characteristic energy, was just beginning another work week. Yellow cabs zipped through congested avenues, pedestrians in sharp business attire hurriedly grabbed their coffees, and the subway system roared beneath the ground, carrying millions of commuters towards their destinations. It was a routine that defined New Yorkers, a symphony of controlled chaos that seemed invincible. Among this sea of ordinary workers, lingering unnoticed within the general crowd, there were 6 individuals whose presence carried an ominous weight. They appeared unremarkable at first glance, backpacks slung over their shoulders, slightly worn coats to fend off the lingering winter chill, and purposeful strides as though they were late for an important meeting. Yet, a closer look would reveal subtle but unsettling details: darting eyes, tense posture, tightly clenched fists. These were not employees rushing to an office or students heading to class. Each one of them had meticulously calculated their moves. They boarded the subway at 6 separate stations across the city, dispersed like shadows with a goal that seemed chillingly aligned. The New York City subway, a labyrinth of interconnected lines and stations, was the beating heart of the city, handling more than 5 million riders daily. For any city dweller, the anonymity of this vast system was both comforting and daunting. On that Monday, this characteristic of the subway, its sprawling infrastructure and extensive interconnectedness, would become a double-edged sword. The morning rush had packed the cars to full capacity, the familiar sounds of screeching wheels blending with the rhythmic hum of conversations, rustling newspapers, and the occasional briefcase clicking shut. It was just another Monday. No one noticed the unusual tension in a man's step, or the way a woman gripped the edges of her backpack a little too tightly. No one thought twice about the items they carried, hidden in plain sight, mundane bags containing components of an unthinkable plan. These 6 individuals weren't acting alone. All were under the influence of a shadowy and enigmatic group that operated on the fringes of society, veiled by layers of secrecy and conspiracy. This organization, calling itself the Purifiers, was a burgeoning extremist sect that preyed on the disenfranchised, twisting their discontent into a destructive ideology. Led by their charismatic but deeply troubled leader, Marcus Hale, the group merged pseudo-religious dogma with apocalyptic rage against what they perceived as a corrupt and unworthy society. For months, Marcus Hale and his inner circle had been planning this operation, methodically stockpiling illegal chemical components and recruiting loyal followers with promises of salvation through cleansing the unworthy. The subway attack was designed not only as an act of terror, but as a perverse statement, a demonstration of their capability to strike at the very core of American life. Their target was chosen deliberately. The intricate web of subway lines symbolized the connections among people, commerce, and culture. To halt the subway was to fracture the rhythm of the city, bring it to its knees, and broadcast a chilling message to the country and the world. As the clock ticked closer to 8 a.m., the planned moment of execution, the 6 operatives were in position. Each had clear instructions: board a specific train, place the device, and exit at predetermined stations. The timing was critical, and every move rehearsed countless times. Beneath the masks of ordinary commuters, their faces betrayed flickers of doubt and fear, small cracks in the exterior of their chilling resolve. Some wrestled with the morality of their mission, while others focused only on the promise of redemption through destruction, ignoring the humanity of the thousands whose lives they were about to devastate. Above ground, the city carried on, blissfully ignorant of the invisible storm gathering below. It was a calm before the chaos, a fragile moment frozen in time. Were there signs that someone might have noticed? Perhaps there were passing glances at the overly nervous young man fumbling with his bag, or a woman avoiding eye contact at all costs. But in a subway filled with characters and stories of every kind, such moments rarely invited suspicion. Little did the passengers, the onlookers, or even the city authorities know that the lives of thousands were about to be forever altered. Hidden within the ordinary flow of Monday morning routines was the seed of one of the darkest days in modern history, a shocking testament to the ease with which terror could blend seamlessly into the backdrop of daily life. And as the clock struck 8:15 a.m., the wheels of a nightmarish chain of events were set in motion. A large-scale terrorist attack. At exactly 8:15 a.m., an otherwise ordinary Monday morning turned into pure chaos. The 6 members of the shadowy organization calling themselves the Purifiers simultaneously sprang into action, each of them, stationed on separate subway lines crisscrossing New York City, carefully followed the plans they had rehearsed countless times. With mechanical precision, they unzipped their inconspicuous black backpacks, revealing carefully constructed devices laced with a volatile chemical compound. The subway carriages were packed shoulder to shoulder, the air already heavy with the mixture of body heat, rushed conversations, and the metallic screech of wheels grinding against steel tracks. In one car on the 7th Avenue line, a man in his late 30s, nervously glancing around, pulled a bundle wrapped in layers of newspaper from his bag. Nearby passengers initially paid him no mind. They were either immersed in their morning routines or glued to their smartphones. However, when the man's hands visibly trembled while handling the object, a teenage girl sitting nearby furrowed her brow, sensing that something was amiss. Before she could say a word, the man struck the package with a concealed sharp object. A screech, and the slight sound of tearing disharmonized the car's rhythm, followed by the faint hissing noise of gas escaping its container. Similar scenes were unfolding across 5 other subway routes. Each operative, in their designated train car, pierced their chemical-filled packages at nearly the same moment. A wispy, seemingly harmless vapor began to emit, swirling discreetly around unsuspecting passengers. At first it smelled faintly sweet, almost like burnt almonds, then suddenly turned noxious, striking the airways of anyone who inhaled it. The reaction was swift and horrifying. A middle-aged man in a tailored gray suit was the first to notice his throat tightening unnaturally, as if someone had wrapped invisible hands around his neck. He clutched his throat, fell to his knees, and collapsed. Within minutes, pandemonium erupted. Textbook symptoms of chemical exposure manifested throughout each subway car: uncontrollable coughing, dizziness, blurred vision, nausea, and convulsions. A woman gasped, clawing at her neck as if she could pull the invisible toxins away. One man gripped a metal pole for support before his legs buckled under him. Mothers desperately shielded their children as the chaos swallowed them. Commotion turned to cries, screams, and desperate pleas for help. The confined space of the subway cars made escape nearly impossible. On the A train headed downtown, a young professional, still gripping her cup of coffee, covered her face with her scarf, trying to make sense of what was happening. She shouted for everyone to stay calm, but her words were drowned out by the sound of others shouting, crying, and crumpling to the ground as their bodies betrayed them. Passengers tried desperately to force open sealed subway car doors, pounding on the glass windows with all the strength their panicked bodies could muster. On one train approaching its next stop, a quick-thinking passenger hit the emergency brake, bringing the train to an abrupt halt between 2 stations. Though it worsened the chaos inside, some believed it was the only chance to save lives by stopping the train from spreading further disaster down the line. Meanwhile, above ground, life in the city initially continued undisturbed. Taxi drivers honked impatiently at slow-moving pedestrians, office workers adjusted their ties as they headed into high-rise buildings. Nobody yet knew that a silent storm was sweeping across the subway system below, turning an everyday rush hour into utter carnage. Emergency services were alerted minutes after the first reports of unexplained illnesses began streaming in from panicked subway personnel at multiple stations. Initially, the calls described general medical concerns, seizures, fainting, choking, but the sheer volume of calls pouring in from seemingly unrelated locations spread alarm through the dispatch center. Reports from 6 major subway lines all described eerily similar scenarios, confirming that this was no ordinary incident. By 8:20 a.m., EMS teams, firefighters, and hazardous materials units raced across the city, their sirens piercing the morning air. Streets that had been bustling just moments earlier now parted anxiously as emergency vehicles headed toward subway entrances. Commuters heading to work found themselves halted at barricades, watching in confusion as first responders in hazmat suits descended underground. The first paramedics who entered the subway tunnels were unprepared for what they found. Some cars of the affected trains resembled war zones. Passengers sprawled on the ground, many unconscious, some who had stopped breathing entirely. The floors were littered with scattered personal belongings, heels kicked off in panic, overturned briefcases, crushed smartphones, and even reusable coffee cups leaking half-finished lattes. The surviving passengers were carried or dragged out into open air, many of them barely able to walk, gasping for clean oxygen. Outside the subway, the scene above became increasingly chaotic. Near the 42nd Street station, paramedics set up triage tents to attend to the growing number of victims pouring from the subway exits. Crowds formed quickly, with bystanders snapping photos and videos, unsure of whether they were witnessing a disaster in progress or the beginnings of something even worse. News helicopters circled above within minutes, capturing aerial footage of the pandemonium. As more details trickled in, a chilling pattern emerged. This was no accident, it was deliberate, with multiple subway lines simultaneously affected by the same mysterious chemical substance. City officials realized they were facing a coordinated terrorist attack on an unprecedented scale. By 9 a.m., all trains in the New York City subway system were ordered to halt, leaving hundreds of thousands stranded. Centers of commerce emptied as buildings went into lockdown out of fear the attacks might expand into other areas of the city. Back underground, the mysterious gas revealed its full, horrifying effects. Investigators in hazmat suits isolated small fragments of the disassembled devices left behind by the attackers. Analysis revealed the substance released was a chemically modified nerve agent, specifically designed to cause as much harm as possible in confined spaces. It didn't just attack lungs and throats, it scrambled nervous systems, leading to seizures, paralysis, and in several cases, death. The site was haunting. Train cars abandoned in the tunnels, corridors still thick with lingering toxins. Ambulances rolled on and off the scene, struggling to keep pace with the number of patients in need of care. The sounds of sirens, cries for help, and instructions shouted through megaphones blended into an overwhelming cacophony. New York, a city of constant motion, was now paralyzed both in spirit and in physical movement. By 10 a.m., social media exploded with live streams and updates, fueling an unprecedented level of panic. Misinformation spread like wildfire, with rumors circulating about additional attacks, toxic clouds wafting through the financial district, and even impending evacuations. In the absence of clear answers, fear consumed the city. Federal intelligence agencies were called in, declaring the incident an act of terror with implications far beyond New York City's borders. The coordinated attack was more than an act of malice. It was a symbolic strike at the heart of American life. The lifeblood of the busiest city in the U.S. had been brought to a standstill, and the psychological wounds ran as deep as the physical devastation unfolding underground. The panic of the city. The first ambulance sirens pierced through the New York morning at around 8:25 a.m., cutting through the usual cacophony of horns and chatter. What began as isolated reports of subway passengers collapsing quickly snowballed into a full-blown citywide emergency. Within minutes, chaos crept out of the subway tunnels and spilled onto the streets of Manhattan. A city that prided itself on resilience and readiness was blindsided as fear became contagious. Near Times Square, commuters rushing to work froze in their tracks as waves of civilians, many coughing uncontrollably and gasping for air, stumbled out of the subway entrances. Some clawed at their throats, their skin pale and damp with sweat. People were collapsing in their tracks. Others were barely able to walk, leaning against lampposts and walls for support, blinking through blurred vision, or blinking back terror. Street vendors abandoned their carts, retreating to the safety of nearby storefronts, their faces filled with confusion and worry. "Do not enter the subway!" a woman in a business suit shouted as she bolted up the steps, her voice cracking with panic. She clutched her bag like a lifeline, her heels clicking in frantic rhythm on the pavement. Others who fled brought mixed accounts. Talk of some kind of gas, of passengers falling to the floor convulsing. Many had no idea what was happening, but the sight of rushing ambulances painted a terrifying picture. Near Union Square, a mother shepherded her two young children through the crowd, both crying uncontrollably as she repeatedly glanced over her shoulder, unsure if danger was following. At the same moment, a man in scrubs still clutching his medical bag from the night shift at a nearby hospital jumped into action, offering assistance to a fellow commuter stumbling out of the station. "Breathe slow, take small breaths, help is on the way," he shouted, his voice trembling under the weight of a growing realization. They were in the middle of something much larger. Car horns blared impatiently as emergency vehicles began shutting down key arteries across Midtown. Police commandeered intersections as pedestrians were ushered away from subway entrances. The initial explanation on police radios described it as an unidentified gas leak, but reports coming in from multiple stations suggested something far more sinister. Panic became the invisible thread connecting neighborhoods. What began as confusion in the subways quickly climbed sky high as the city became a powder keg of misinformation and hysteria. Social media, in all its raw immediacy, fanned the flames. Videos began circulating of passengers on the floor of subway trains, their bodies convulsing, and others screaming for help. Cryptic tweets read, "Don't breathe, there's gas in the subway." Posts said poison was spreading through the ventilation grates, while others speculated that bombs were next. Within just an hour, hashtags like #SubwayAttack and #NYCUnderSiege were trending worldwide. Above ground, the city's heartbeat grew erratic. People crowded near TV displays and electronics stores, eager for updates, their faces glued to static-laced live shots of emergency vehicles around major subway stations. Local anchors reported on air, visibly shaken as the situations unfolded in real time. Restaurants and cafes that had been full minutes earlier now sat mostly abandoned, their patrons pouring into the streets, glued to their phones or feverishly making calls to loved ones. By 9 a.m., hospital emergency rooms faced an unprecedented strain. Doctors donned protective masks as injured and unconscious passengers arrived in waves. Many exhibited severe respiratory distress, wheezing, choking, eyes darting frantically from anguish. One ER nurse described the scene as something out of a disaster drill, but the horror on people's faces was far too real to mistake for a simulation. The triage unit struggled, chaotic and overwhelmed. Emergency responders turned parking lots into makeshift treatment areas as ambulances lined up in queues. Patients were separated into priority levels, those with a chance of survival rushed inside, while others received care under hastily erected tarps outside. Orders for oxygen tanks skyrocketed, while doctors scrambled for answers about what they were treating, frantically relaying symptoms to toxicologists. As the minutes dragged on, ordinary citizens froze in collective confusion. Office workers were evacuated in droves, especially near key government buildings. Rumors hit fever pitch. Some whispered about acts of war, foreign attacks, or nuclear fallout spreading through the city. Crowds formed outside police barricades set up on major avenues like 5th and Broadway, their faces filled with questions nobody had answers for. "We don't know yet, just stay indoors," an NYPD officer barked, trying to keep order as dozens of people shouted at him from behind yellow caution tape. Meanwhile, parts of the financial district ground to a halt. Major banks went into lockdown as Wall Street traders checked their stock tickers on one screen while refreshing news reports on another. Business deals stopped mid-sentence, boardrooms emptied, and calls to evacuate skyscrapers became a domino effect through the city. The heart of American capitalism paused, temporarily gripping the implications of what felt like an unprecedented, coordinated strike. Elsewhere, such as Central Park, there were surreal moments of quiet. Tourists who hadn't yet caught on to the chaos continued snapping selfies, oblivious to the sirens wailing in the distance. In these quieter parts of the city, life rolled on almost mockingly normal for a brief moment longer. Calm before the hysteria inevitably reached them too. Media outlets scrambled to relay the scope of the crisis. By 10 a.m., reports began confirming the presence of a toxic nerve agent. The gravity of that announcement sent shockwaves through the city. Some compared it to biochemical warfare, and others dredged up memories of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. People already seated at schools or offices wondered if they should leave, or if stepping outside risked exposure to something invisible. Parents rushed to pull their children from schools. Lines at pharmacies grew long as panicked residents bought masks, gloves, and anything that might serve as protection against airborne threats. City leadership convened in an emergency session. The mayor of New York, visibly pale but composed, addressed the city in a hastily arranged press conference. "Ladies and gentlemen, I promise you, we are working round the clock to understand what's happening. Remain calm, stay off public transport, and please stay indoors if at all possible." But calm was a forgotten concept among many. By early afternoon, images of decontamination crews, dressed head to toe in hazmat suits, began flooding the airwaves. They sprayed chemical neutralizing solutions over subway exits, establishing red-zoned perimeters. Fire departments attempted to ventilate affected areas, but the subway tunnels themselves were proving difficult to decontaminate entirely. Even as the city began to stabilize later in the day, the psychological wounds were already written on the faces of New Yorkers. Friends frantically called one another to confirm they were okay. Families stayed glued to televisions, many wondering for the first time whether they could trust the air they breathed. At its core, New York had temporarily lost the essence of its invincibility. Its identity as a city that never stops moving had been replaced by sudden, shocking stillness, shattered trust, and an unshakable sense of paranoia. The nerve agent used. As the horrifying details of the subway attacks began to surface, investigators raced against the clock to determine the cause of the sudden and devastating symptoms that radiated through New York's vital underground system. By the time hazmat teams and chemical weapons experts arrived on the scene, the damage was already severe. Dozens of victims lay unconscious, while even more suffered from compromised breathing, muscle spasms, and deteriorating vision. The question on everyone's mind, from city engineers to federal intelligence agencies, was chillingly simple: what could cause such overwhelming destruction in such a short amount of time? The answer came hours later, when a sophisticated mobile chemistry lab took its preliminary findings to federal authorities. The substance used in the attacks was identified as VX nerve agent, one of the most lethal chemical weapons ever conceived. Originally developed during the mid-20th century as a military nerve agent, VX was infamous not only for its unparalleled potency, but also for its insidious nature. A mere drop of VX on the skin could kill an adult within minutes. If inhaled, its effects were even more catastrophic, shutting down the body's ability to control its vital processes, including breathing, within seconds. VX operates by targeting the human nervous system in a disturbingly methodical way. It blocks an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, which is critical for proper nerve function. Without this enzyme, neurotransmitters continue to fire uncontrollably, sending muscles and organs into a state of prolonged contraction. Victims of VX exposure often suffer from violent seizures, hypersalivation, involuntary convulsions of their diaphragm, and ultimately death through respiratory failure. The sensation experts describe is as though the body is attacking itself from the inside out, an invisible executioner that leaves no visible wounds, only chaos within. Unlike conventional explosives or firearms, nerve agents like VX represent a level of premeditated cruelty that is difficult to fathom. Unlike a bullet that kills instantaneously, VX weaponizes time itself, dragging victims through excruciating symptoms and agonizing effects as they fight to survive. It was this decisive aspect of VX, the terror in how it worked, that defined the attack as more than an act of violence. It was psychological warfare. For Marcus Hale and his extremist faction, the Purifiers, choosing VX was deliberate. Its very existence underscored their reputation for tactical precision and a warped intellectualism that bordered on terrifying. Months before the attack, Hale had apparently orchestrated clandestine operations to acquire the components needed to synthesize VX. While production of VX is widely outlawed under international chemical weapons treaties, Hale and his followers exploited regulatory loopholes and black markets, importing industrial-grade organophosphates and other restricted compounds under the guise of agricultural chemical manufacturing. Witness interviews and evidence uncovered during later investigations suggested the group had converted an abandoned factory in rural Pennsylvania into an illegal chemical weapons laboratory, where they meticulously built their deadly stockpile. Investigators discovered that the VX used in the subway attacks wasn't merely stolen from old military stockpiles, it was synthesized in-house. The faction had access to advanced chemical engineering expertise, with several of its members possessing PhDs in fields like biochemistry and organic chemistry. This made them uniquely capable of reverse engineering weaponized compounds, and VX became their weapon of choice due to its high lethality in confined spaces, such as subway cars. "A chemical like VX doesn't just cause death," remarked one counterterrorism analyst during a late-night briefing session at the FBI headquarters. "It broadcasts power. It sends a message that not only are you willing to kill, but you're willing to kill in the most horrifying, clinical way possible." This wasn't just about casualty numbers, it was about fear. The symptoms of VX were first noticed on the subway by victims and witnesses who described a sweet, almost floral odor in the air, quickly followed by nausea, dizziness, and a terrifying inability to breathe. Unbeknownst to most of the passengers, even a few micrograms of VX were enough to spark a wide-scale medical disaster. Because the attacks happened during rush hour, packed subway cars meant that one moment of exposure could incapacitate dozens instantly. The VX's vaporized form allowed it to spread rapidly through the pressurized air systems of the trains and station tunnels, effectively poisoning hundreds of people in mere minutes. Chemical weapons experts later remarked that the devices used in the attack were disturbingly sophisticated for a non-state actor. The VX had been stored in stabilized liquid form within glass ampules, then wrapped securely in protective casings to delay accidental dispersal. The attackers used small, puncture-proof plastic tubes to conceal the nerve agent until the moment of release. Once punctured, with sharp objects or improvised tools like screwdriver tips, the nerve agent vaporized almost instantaneously, ensuring rapid dissemination. It was methodical, rehearsed, calculated, and horrifyingly effective. Despite the precision of the devices, traces of VX residue left behind in the subway cars offered crucial evidence. Specialists from the U.S. Army's Chemical Materials Agency were flown in to assist local law enforcement with decontamination efforts and forensic analysis. With their help, investigators determined the specific chemical signature of the VX used in the attack, tracing it back to precursor chemicals purchased from Eastern European suppliers. This global footprint added an entirely new layer of complexity to the case, confirming the international reach of Hale's meticulously planned operation. What made the situation even more tragic was the disparity in disaster preparedness. Although New York's first responders were quick to mobilize, none of them could have been fully prepared to manage a chemical attack of this magnitude. Initial responders often lacked specialized equipment, and at least 6 NYPD officers and EMS workers became secondary victims, exposed while assisting passengers. Their plight further amplified the terror, as it became clear that even the uniforms of safety could not shield against the invisible threat. For every person who survived exposure to VX, the scars ran deep. Burns, nerve damage, and lifelong neurological impairments became grim reminders of what had transpired. Even those who experienced mild exposure spoke of nightmares, sweating palms, and the sound of those around them convulsing on subway floors, all etched into their minds like battle scars. While some survivors later agreed to speak about their experiences, others remained silent, haunted by the ghosts of a moment unlike any the city had ever faced. The use of VX wasn't just an act of violence, it was a showcase of resourcefulness, capability, and, above all else, the unrelenting determination of a group willing to cross every line of morality to make their twisted statement. The attack forced America to examine not only its vulnerabilities but also the dark reality of how modern terror adapts. In a city built to endure, VX revealed a fragility that no one wanted to believe could exist. As the sun set on the day of the attack, the once proud skyline of New York seemed overshadowed by an invisible shadow, one not of collapsing towers or bombs but of gas, fear, and the suffocating weight of uncertainty. Over the coming weeks, the city's spirit would struggle to rebound. For those who lived through those moments in the subway, breathing poisoned air and witnessing friends collapse, trust in the world around them had been permanently and irreparably shaken. Initial investigations and suspects. Even as the first responders struggled to contain the immediate fallout of the subway attacks, another critical operation was beginning to unfold above ground. Within the first hour of the crisis, senior officials at the FBI, New York's Counterterrorism Task Force and Homeland Security convened in an emergency teleconference. From the start, it was clear that this was no random act of violence. The simultaneous nature of the attacks, their coordination across multiple subway lines, and the use of a sophisticated nerve agent, pointed to something unfathomably large. This was the work of a well-organized terrorist group, not a lone actor. The clock was ticking, and answers had to come quickly. The first clues. By 12 p.m., chemical weapons experts confirmed what victims in the subway tunnels already knew too well. The substance dispersed in the attacks was VX, a highly toxic nerve agent that could only have been manufactured or acquired by someone with significant scientific knowledge and resources. This revelation narrowed the focus of the investigation. Whoever orchestrated this attack had access to advanced laboratory equipment, funding, and the technical expertise necessary to synthesize an internationally banned substance. It was also clear that this wasn't the work of amateurs. The devices at each attack site demonstrated a level of engineering precision rarely seen outside the sphere of state-sponsored military operations. Forensics teams worked around the clock, combing through the subway cars and tunnels for viable evidence. Every device fragment, every residue sample, every discarded piece of clothing was treated as a potential lead. Amid the chaos and destruction, investigators struck their first break. 2 small plastic casings with chemical traces of VX, along with faint fingerprints, were found in one subway car. What's more, security footage from nearby stations showed several of the suspected operatives boarding the trains, their faces partially obscured but not completely hidden. The surveillance footage didn't capture everything, but it was enough to reveal the overarching truth: they weren't dealing with mystery perpetrators. These people had faces, movements, and patterns. Their humanity, cold and calculating as it was, left a trail. The profile of the suspects. As investigators began piecing together information, behavioral analysts from the FBI got to work profiling the criminals behind the attack. This wasn't a case of impulsive violence or ideological self-sacrifice carried out in a spontaneous burst of anger. It was cold, methodical, and deeply deliberate. The operatives shown in the security footage kept their faces neutral and their body language detached. They exhibited no signs of panic or hesitation before planting the devices, behavior that suggested extensive training. This detachment, combined with their knowledge of chemistry, pointed to a specific kind of perpetrator. Members of a disciplined hierarchical group, likely led by someone charismatic enough to demand absolute loyalty. This analysis quickly led investigators to a disturbing possibility. They were dealing with the Purifiers, a fringe extremist organization that had been on the FBI's watch list for years. Founded by Marcus Hale, an enigmatic and powerfully persuasive leader, the Purifiers combined apocalyptic pseudo-religious ideology with militant leanings. Although they largely operated in secrecy, Hale's sermons, describing a so-called cleansing of society's unworthy, had been recorded and distributed online, primarily to recruit disaffected individuals seeking purpose in a world they felt had failed them. Many of his followers believed that to incite chaos was to seed salvation. Assembling the evidence. The FBI's next steps were surgical. In order to understand how the Purifiers might have orchestrated such a deadly and synchronized act, they reached out to key allies, cybercrime units, chemical experts, and international law enforcement. Teams worked on mining the group's digital footprint, uncovering encrypted communication across dark web forums, chat rooms, and underground markets. Here's where they found their next lead. The data revealed that, in the months leading up to the attack, there had been a spike in purchases of organophosphate chemicals, one of the components used in the creation of VX. Some purchases were made by shell companies registered under false aliases, while others were acquired through black market distributors based in Eastern Europe. The common thread tying these transactions together was unmistakable. Each supplier's cargo was routed to Pennsylvania, a state where federal authorities already suspected the Purifiers were operating in rural facilities under the false pretense of agricultural manufacturing. Further investigation shed light on some of the inner processes of the operation. Laboratories had been established in the shell of a deserted fertilizer plant outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, hidden behind a facade of legitimate industrial activity. Hale's group didn't just recruit followers, they sought expertise. Among those behind the lab work were several defectors from prestigious academic institutions, scientists with the technical skills required to transform precursor chemicals into VX. This realization deepened the horror of the attack, demonstrating that the Purifiers weren't merely ideologues, they were determined, lethal engineers of mass destruction. Nationwide hunt. With these revelations now forming the backbone of the investigation, federal agents fanned out across the Northeast. Teams executed search warrants at known affiliated properties while tracing both physical and digital connections between alleged members of the group. Back in New York, NYPD's counterterrorism division worked through anonymous tips pouring in as citizens scrambled to help provide information, no matter how small. Transportation hubs became hot zones of scrutiny. TSA agents doubled down on passenger screenings at airports, while Amtrak reinforced its own safety measures. State-level agencies issued advisories about possible secondary attacks, though investigators had yet to find evidence suggesting the organization had plans beyond its subway-based devastation. Still, the residual panic spread as citizens feared that their most routine public spaces, trains, buses, shopping malls, could turn into the next target. Real progress came when one of the operatives was identified through fingerprint matches in the subway and caught on camera withdrawing cash at an ATM shortly before the attack. Recognized as an ex-chemistry professor who had previously disappeared after expressing radical views publicly, the man became the first operational link investigators had to Marcus Hale himself. His capture would become the cornerstone of a cat-and-mouse operation to bring down the organization's entire leadership. The emergence of Marcus Hale. No figure loomed larger over the investigation than Marcus Hale, the shadowy leader of the Purifiers. Described by former members as a manipulative and messianic figure, Hale's fiery rhetoric painted society as irredeemably corrupt, calling for an apocalyptic reset. FBI analysts began compiling a psychological profile, labeling him as an egotistical opportunist with a gift for preying on insecurity and desperation. Hale's charisma was his weapon. His ability to reframe terrorism as a righteous quest for justice created hardened soldiers out of lost souls. One agent summed it up chillingly. Hale didn't just create loyalty, he created believers, people willing to die, kill, or spread poison, all because they thought they were part of a divine mission. The cult leader and the conspiracy. At the center of the tragedy that unfolded on that fateful Monday morning was one man, Marcus Hale. To understand the devastation wrought by the Purifiers, the shadowy extremist sect responsible for the subway attacks, it's essential to first understand Hale himself. A man of alarming intellect and charisma, Hale was the kind of figure who could take the broken shards of human despair and piece them together into a dangerous weapon. His ability to manipulate, inspire, and devastate would make him one of the most infamous domestic terrorists in American history. Marcus Hale's path to infamy wasn't carved overnight. Born in 1965 in rural Ohio, Hale's upbringing was marked by extreme poverty and a strained relationship with his parents. His father was a factory worker with a sharp temper and a tendency toward violence, while his mother drifted between jobs to keep food on the table. By all accounts, young Hale was a gifted child, excelling in academics, particularly in the sciences and theology, but he also showed early signs of emotional instability. Teachers described him as a loner, brilliant but distant, with an eerie tendency to fixate on apocalyptic themes in his classwork. Hale's academic achievements eventually earned him a scholarship to a prestigious Midwest university, where he majored in biochemistry and philosophy, a combination that would later become integral to the terrifying synthesis of his intellect and his ideology. It was during his time at college that Hale began developing the foundations of his extremist beliefs. Rejecting traditional religious values, he instead fixated on the idea that humanity was inherently corrupt, that modern institutions were beyond redemption, and that salvation could only come through violent, purifying destruction. His dorm room was said to be cluttered with books on philosophy, obscure cult leaders, and chemical compounds, a swirling mix of ideas that would later converge into a toxic doctrine. By the time he reached his late 20s, Hale had experienced a series of personal setbacks. He was rejected from prestigious graduate programs, his fiancée left him, and he failed to hold down a steady job. These events seemed to deepen his bitterness toward the world and further solidified his belief that society was rotting from within. He began giving impromptu lectures in public parks and community centers, espousing his views on cleansing society and earning a small yet devoted following of outcasts who were drawn to his eloquence and clarity in condemning a system they, too, felt alienated by. The rise of the Purifiers. In 1991, Marcus Hale founded the Purifiers, an extremist group that would grow from a fringe organization to a sophisticated domestic terror network. Initially, Hale's group presented itself as a grassroots movement against societal corruption. They targeted vulnerable and disillusioned individuals, people who had suffered financial hardship, systemic prejudice, or personal loss, and offered them a sense of purpose under the guise of spiritual and intellectual enlightenment. Hale's fiery speeches, described as equal parts sermon and manifesto, promised not just revenge against a sick society, but also redemption for those who followed him. The ideology of the Purifiers was an apocalyptic blend of pseudo-religious doctrine, pseudoscience, and militant anarchism. Hale preached that the modern world was on the verge of collapse, rotted to its core by greed, immorality, and industrial excess. In his view, humanity had failed the planet, and the only way to save it, and to save themselves, was to wipe the slate clean. He often invoked imagery of fire, floods, and purifying storms, casting himself as a kind of messianic figure sent to cleanse the earth of its impurities. Hale's rhetoric also centered on the notion of deserving survivors. He claimed that society needed to undergo a violent reckoning to separate the so-called unworthy masses from a select few who could rebuild a perfected world, free from the vices he believed had doomed humanity. Among his followers, this quickly bred a dangerous sense of superiority and purpose. Members of the Purifiers were no longer just ordinary people. They were soldiers in what they believed was a divine war against societal decay. The recruitment and indoctrination process. Marcus Hale's brilliance lay not only in his ability to craft a compelling ideology, but also in his skill at identifying and manipulating recruits. People didn't join the Purifiers overnight. They were gradually drawn in through a process of grooming and indoctrination. Hale targeted individuals who were disillusioned, desperate, or disconnected. Veterans who felt abandoned by society, scientists frustrated by what they saw as bureaucratic barriers to progress, young adults estranged from their families, all became prime targets for his movement. Prospective members were often lured to remote compounds under the guise of self-improvement retreats, where the process of indoctrination began. At these retreats, Hale's fiery sermons took center stage. He would spend hours delivering meticulously prepared speeches, blending his knowledge of biochemistry with apocalyptic metaphors, painting a bleak picture of society's impending doom. He convinced his followers that they were chosen, a hand-selected vanguard tasked with purging the world of its sickness. Over time, newcomers were separated from their families, encouraged to abandon their old lives, and immersed in a culture of absolute loyalty to Hale and the group. Hale's followers didn't just see him as a leader, they revered him as a prophet. Some claimed he was divinely inspired, while others believed his scientific background gave him unparalleled insight. Whatever the reason, Hale wielded an almost hypnotic hold on his followers. They trusted him with their finances, their safety, and ultimately, their lives. From words to weapons. By the mid-1990s, the Purifiers had evolved beyond a spiritual movement. Under Marcus Hale's guidance, the group began assembling an arsenal, not of guns or bombs, but of chemical weapons. Hale's background in biochemistry became the cornerstone of their operations. He reasoned that chemical attacks, unlike traditional warfare, could destabilize society on a far deeper level. Chemical agents were invisible, insidious, and inherently terrifying, and they embodied the kind of cleansing Hale had always envisioned. Hale and his inner circle spent months planning the Day of Reckoning, the code name for the subway attacks. Their goal wasn't just to kill, it was to deliver a symbolic blow to the heart of modern society. By targeting New York City's subway system, the very arteries that kept the city alive, they aimed to cripple its spirit, disrupt its lifeblood, and send a clear message of the power they wielded. In an abandoned fertilizer plant in rural Pennsylvania, the Purifiers set up a covert chemical weapons lab. Using stolen materials, black market components, and the expertise of former scientists who had joined their ranks, they synthesized the VX nerve agent used in the attacks. Every step of their operation was carefully rehearsed, from the construction of the delivery devices to the logistics of their deployment. Hale operated with the precision of a general planning a war, ensuring that no detail was overlooked, the shadow of Marcus Hale. To his followers, Marcus Hale was a savior. To the rest of the world, he was a monster. After the subway attacks, his name became synonymous with terror, hatred, and the depths of human depravity. While Hale himself didn't set foot in a subway car that morning, his fingerprints were on every aspect of the operation. He was the mastermind, the puppet master, and the prophet of chaos who convinced ordinary people to commit atrocities in the name of divine justice. Blind hearts. The tragedy of the subway attacks didn't begin with the release of VX nerve gas. It began long before, in the quiet moments when the Purifiers first sank their claws into the lives of vulnerable individuals, breaking them down piece by piece and remaking them in Marcus Hale's image. The story of those who followed Hale, the ones who carried out his heinous orders, blinded by their devotion, is as much a cautionary tale as it is a bitter reflection of how even the best of intentions or the deepest pain can be corrupted into weapons of destruction. The individuals who carried out the subway attacks weren't born terrorists or killers. They were teachers, veterans, students, struggling parents, ordinary people whose fractured lives made them easy prey for Hale's manipulative charisma. Each of them came to the Purifiers with questions, wounds, or anger that they couldn't voice anywhere else. And within the twisted teachings of the cult, they found a clarity that blurred the line between redemption and obliteration. The broken, the lost, and the angry Hale's followers weren't unified by backgrounds, but by emptiness. Among them was Theodore Manning, a former school science teacher from Indiana. Manning had spent over a decade molding young minds in his high school chemistry lab, but budget cuts and bad press about failing schools left him disillusioned. He was eventually let go in favor of younger, cheaper hires. Over time, the pride he once took in his students faded into resentment, against the government, against the system, and eventually, against humanity itself. For months after losing his job, Manning spent sleepless nights in online forums, venting his frustrations in dark corners of the internet where anger festered unchecked. And that's where he found the Purifiers. Hale's videos didn't speak to him as some generic motivational self-help coach. Hale spoke his language. He talked about the failure of the system, the way institutions rot from the inside, and most intoxicatingly, Hale promised an answer, a way to strike back against the machine that had chewed him up and spit him out. Nina Daniels, another operative in the subway attack, came to the Purifiers under vastly different circumstances. She was a mother of 2 in Kansas, working 3 jobs to make ends meet after her husband left her. She believed in hard work and pushed herself to her breaking point every day, only to see bills piling higher and her children growing more distant. When her youngest daughter needed surgery, Nina couldn't afford it, and the guilt consumed her like wildfire. That's when she stumbled upon one of Hale's videos framed as a lecture on self-reliance and systemic failure. By the time she made contact with Hale's local chapter, she was desperate for purpose and answers. Over months of indoctrination, Hale convinced her that her suffering wasn't her fault, but rather the result of society's broken structure. A structure that needed to be burned to the ground for people like her to finally be free. The stories of Manning and Daniels mirrored those of countless other members. Veterans who felt discarded after their tours. College students who thought the constant race for success only served the rich and powerful. Scientists who felt stifled by institutional red tape. What united these individuals wasn't just desperation, it was the belief that they had no alternative. Hale's genius lay in taking those feelings of despair and channeling them into anger. He didn't just connect to his followers, he provided a scapegoat and a purpose. The indoctrination. It didn't happen overnight. Each member of the Purifiers was subjected to a slow, deliberate process of psychological conditioning that exploited their vulnerabilities. Recruits were invited to workshops or retreats under the guise of empowerment seminars. For newcomers, these events were filled with careful contrasts, light moments of camaraderie and joy interspersed with speeches designed to sow existential doubt and fear of the outside world. Marcus Hale carefully painted a picture of society as a corrupt, irredeemable machine, grinding innocent people into dust. He posed as the antidote to hopelessness, constantly reinforcing the idea that his adherents were the chosen few, capable of seeing society for the lie it truly was. Step by step, the recruits were isolated from their old lives. Contact with family and friends dwindled. Social media accounts disappeared. Slowly but surely, Hale's ideology became central to their identities, infecting every aspect of their thought processes. Acts of loyalty were first measured in small ways: donations of money or time, cutting ties with uncooperative loved ones. Then came more substantial asks: full immersion in the group's facilities, complete submission to Hale's teachings, and finally, participation in acts of cleansing the world. Hale's sermons offered chilling reassurances to those struggling with their doubts. He referred to society as a festering wound, and portrayed himself as the spiritual and intellectual surgeon that could heal it. He told his followers that violence wasn't just a necessity, but a cleansing act of mercy. "You're not destroying," he would say in his signature calm voice. "You're creating. Every building that falls makes room for a new, better one. Every weak link that snaps in the chain brings us closer to a perfected world." Weaponizing belief. The final phase of indoctrination was the most sinister. Hale turned his followers' pain and frustration into unwavering obedience, but he also rewrote their moral compasses entirely. To his devotees, the idea of taking innocent lives became not just acceptable but noble. They weren't taking lives for glory, he preached, but for salvation. By positioning their actions as a grim but sacred duty, Hale stripped them of their capacity for ethical reflection. They saw themselves as soldiers, fighting for the ultimate redemption of humanity. For some operatives, doubts lingered even in the final moments before the attack. Nina Daniels reportedly hesitated seconds before puncturing the device in her subway car. Her hands trembled as years of maternal instincts clashed with months of indoctrination. Yet Hale's words echoed in her mind like scripture, drowning out fear. "Weakness is what brought us to this point. To hesitate, Nina, is to forsake the future you've suffered so much for." Those words were her final signal. With tears streaming down her face, she carried out her orders. The tragedy of blind faith. When the smoke cleared on that horrific morning, the ultimate tragedy wasn't just the hundreds of bodies sprawled across hospital rooms and morgues. It was the realization that the lives of the perpetrators had also been destroyed long before the act itself. They had become hollowed-out versions of themselves, shells filled with doctrine and controlled by Hale's booming influence. Their families, upon learning of their involvement, recoiled in grief and disbelief. Friends who remembered them as dreamers, caregivers, and achievers watched in horror as their loved ones were painted as monsters on the evening news. And yet, in Hale's twisted web, they were victims too. Victims whose searching hearts had been abducted by a force too manipulative, too calculated for them to resist. The warning for the future. The story of Marcus Hale and the Purifiers is more than a tale of destruction. It's a mirror, reflecting how fear, anger, and isolation can be weaponized by those who understand how to exploit them. It's a reminder that extremism doesn't begin with violent acts, it begins in the quietness of despair, where charisma and manipulation can blind even the sharpest hearts. The hunt and capture. In the aftermath of the subway attacks, as New York City reeled from the devastation, federal agencies launched one of the most aggressive manhunts in American history. The hunt for Marcus Hale and his inner circle, those who had orchestrated one of the most chilling acts of domestic terrorism, would take months of tireless investigation, spanning multiple states, hundreds of agents, and a blend of old-fashioned detective work and cutting-edge technology. Time was of the essence. With every passing day, the specter of another attack loomed over the nation like a ticking time bomb, building the web. The investigation began in the chaos-filled hours immediately following the attack. While first responders combed through subway tunnels and treated victims, teams from the FBI, Homeland Security, and New York's Counter-Terrorism Task Force had already begun piecing together what little evidence they had. The fragments of devices left behind in the subway cars, the faint VX chemical traces and video footage of the 6 operatives carrying their deadly cargo onto the trains, became the foundation of their pursuit. Marcus Hale and the Purifiers had been on the FBI's radar for years, but their activities were sporadic, shrouded in secrecy and cloaked as fringe activism. Previous leads had fizzled out or failed to meet the standards for probable cause. This time, there were no more doubts. They had left their fingerprints, literally, in the subway. Lab analysis matched smudged fingerprints on abandoned dispersal devices to known associates of Hale's organization. The web was forming, and it was clear. This was their moment to bring down the Purifiers. The breakthroughs. One of the first significant breakthroughs came when an operative, identified through surveillance footage, was traced to a used car rental agency in Queens. Surveillance video from the rental lot showed the suspect, a man in his mid-30s, leasing a van 2 weeks prior to the attack. The paper trail for that vehicle revealed a series of stops in Pennsylvania, leading investigators directly to a sparse rural town outside Scranton. Neighboring reports described unusual activity near an abandoned fertilizer plant, a fitting cover for what eventually would be confirmed as a chemical weapons laboratory run by Hale's followers. Acting on this lead, agents descended on the property in force. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The lab had been cleared out in the days following the attack, but forensic traces told the story. Chemical residue consistent with VX production, broken ampules and detailed blueprints demonstrating how the dispersal devices had been designed. The site was effectively a factory of terror dedicated to its apocalyptic mission. Among the debris was a partial list of coded communication logs on paper, half-burned but still legible. This was critical. Those codes would later be deciphered to reveal other locations tied to Purifiers' compounds. The chase grows wider. While investigators pursued physical evidence, cybercrime units began scouring encrypted forums, dark web chat rooms, and the few remaining social media accounts linked to the Purifiers. Analysts uncovered encrypted communications between Hale himself and his followers, using aliases but marked by distinct speech patterns that became his signature. These messages revealed a chilling insight into Hale's mindset. He believed the subway attack was just the beginning. Subsequent messages hinted at larger plans. Though vague, they were riddled with apocalyptic tones about an impending reckoning. Operatives across federal agencies grew increasingly concerned. What if Hale wasn't just laying low? What if he was planning something even worse? This rising fear led to the escalation of efforts. Task force units coordinated with local law enforcement across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, and West Virginia, executing raids on suspected affiliate locations. Several mid-level operatives were captured in these sweeps, providing a goldmine of information under interrogation. While most were defiant and stoically loyal to Hale, cracks began to appear in the facade. One operative, a 22-year-old former college student who had been promised a new, enlightened life by Hale, broke under pressure. Her testimony gave investigators the clearest portrait yet of Hale's plans and indicated where he might retreat in the face of mounting pressure. Closing in on Hale. As the net drew tighter, Marcus Hale proved to be a cunning, elusive figure. While he had inspired absolute loyalty in many of his followers, he had also insulated himself masterfully. He had once proclaimed during one of his sermons, "A true leader does not leave his flock vulnerable, but neither does he make himself a martyr prematurely." He had trained his disciples to serve as layers of protection around him, sacrifices, decoys, and obstacles designed to slow the government's pursuit and leave him several steps ahead. Hale's movements, however, betrayed him over time. Agents tracked unusual financial transactions, including bulk purchases at hardware stores and the sudden disappearance of local farm equipment, which was used by the purifiers to run off-grid. Surveillance drones equipped with thermal cameras captured unusual activity at a remote mountainside cabin in the Allegheny National Forest, tucked deep within the woods near the Pennsylvania-Ohio border. When federal agents moved to secure the cabin, they were met with resistance. The site had been reinforced with makeshift barricades, booby traps, and armed guards loyal to Hale. With dialogue having failed, a firefight erupted. Hale was not there, but further searches yielded another major discovery. Inside the cabin, investigators uncovered files detailing emergency evacuation routes for key members of the Purifiers, a possible hideout rotation plan, and coded coordinates leading to another compound across state lines. It was clear Hale had anticipated a siege, but his trail was beginning to crumble. Final showdown. The pursuit culminated weeks later in rural West Virginia, where Hale, his closest lieutenant, and a group of armed followers had deeply entrenched themselves in an abandoned coal mine converted into a secure compound. Federal agents surrounded the area in the dead of night, their movements cloaked by the terrain and sophisticated surveillance systems. The compound itself was a fortress of paranoia, motion sensors, hidden sentries, and escape tunnels designed for a last stand. Knowing negotiation with Hale was futile, the agency prepared for the worst. A tactical team moved in. In the intense, cold silence of the early morning hours, an exchange of gunfire lit up the darkened entrance of the mine. Hale's followers fought fiercely, believing they were fulfilling the apocalyptic prophecy Hale had promised them. Several surrendered only after sustaining injuries, refusing to speak or meet the agent's gaze. For all their violence, their faith in Hale's vision was tragically unbroken. Deeper in the mine's labyrinth-like tunnels, Marcus Hale was finally cornered. Standing in a dimly lit cavern filled with survival supplies and half-erased maps, the cult leader seemed almost serene. "I knew you'd come eventually," he reportedly said, his voice calm, as though elevated above the chaos he had caused. His words didn't waver as he continued. "But look around you. My words will carry farther than any of you can imagine." The arrest itself was uneventful. Hale surrendered without resistance. But his smug demeanor chilled the agents present. One officer described him as a man who truly believed he had won, no matter how confined he was. Aftermath, the price of justice. As Hale was led away, the weight of victory was laced with an undeniable bitterness. The fight was over. But for the countless victims of Hale's ideological crusade, for the families who had lost loved ones in the subway attacks, the survivors who would forever be haunted by the horrors they witnessed, the scars would remain visible for years to come. While the public found relief in the capture of America's most wanted domestic terrorist, the investigation revealed that the reach of Hale's ideology still lingered. Arrests of other affiliated members continued for months, ensuring the threat was minimized at every level. The trial. When Marcus Hale was brought into the courtroom for the first time, whispers rippled through the audience like a frigid wind. Every eye was on the man who had masterminded one of the deadliest and most chilling terrorist attacks in modern American history. Dressed in a simple flannel shirt and slacks that betrayed none of his monstrous deeds, Hale entered accompanied by federal marshals. His expression was cold but self-assured, offering the courtroom a faint, almost smug smile. For many it was the first time they had seen the face of evil in such an unassuming form. The trial of Marcus Hale would capture national and international attention, not only for the unprecedented horror of his crimes, but for the chilling charisma of the man who orchestrated them. Hale's every word, smirk, and calculated move seemed to poison the air with the same venom that had been released into New York's subway system. And yet, through the proceedings, there were moments of reckoning, reminders of the resilience of the victims who came forward to testify, and the unyielding strength of a justice system determined to dismantle his cult of destruction. A case built on nightmares. The prosecution entered the trial with an arsenal of evidence that painted Hale as the undisputed puppet master of the Purifiers. Months of investigations, hundreds of testimonies, and an exhaustive examination of encrypted communications left no doubt. Marcus Hale was not only the leader of the extremist group but also its defining architect. Phone logs, email chains, and manifestos stored in hidden servers all bore Hale's fingerprints. His direct commands to his operatives, including the 6 individuals who executed the VX attack, were damning in their clarity. The VX dispersal devices recovered from the subway cars became central to the prosecution's arguments. Expert witnesses, including FBI chemists and U.S. Army chemical warfare specialists, described in harrowing detail how Hale's group synthesized and weaponized one of the deadliest nerve agents in history. The prosecution showed jurors diagrams, photos of the chemical factory Hale had hidden in Pennsylvania, and survivor testimony from agents who raided his compounds. Every piece of evidence was a stone in the mosaic of Hale's guilt. But what hit home harder than any diagram or forensic breakthrough were the survivors themselves. One after another, survivors of the subway attack took the stand, their voices trembling as they recounted the moments when their lungs seized, their vision blurred, and they thought their lives were slipping away in a fog of invisible death. A firefighter who responded to the scene with no chemical equipment described the moment he realized he was breathing in VX, watching helplessly as civilians collapsed around him. Several of Hale's former followers also testified, opening chilling windows into how Hale manipulated, indoctrinated, and ultimately destroyed them from within. Hale's defense, a stage for madness. Marcus Hale, a man who had spent his entire adult life preaching fear and chaos, treated his trial not as a judgment of his actions, but as a platform for his ideology. Representing himself with a team of court-appointed advisors, Hale was calm, calculated, and eerily poised. He refused to acknowledge guilt, doubling down on his belief that the attack was not an act of terrorism, but a righteous retribution against what he called a morally bankrupt society. During cross-examinations, Hale used his moments to speak to the courtroom, less like a defendant and more like a preacher. He invoked his doctrine of purification, peppering his exchanges with pseudo-intellectual language and philosophical rationalizations for his crimes. "This society is a rotting structure," he said during one outburst, glaring at the jury. "It is cancerous. Every sacrifice made on that subway car was for the greater good. You people, with all your laws and rules, will never see that." The judge, Chief Justice Eleanor Morales, worked tirelessly to keep the trial on the rails. Firm, deliberate, and unshakable, Morales refused to let Hale turn her courtroom into a revival for his deadly ideology. "This is not a pulpit, Mr. Hale," she said after yet another of his provocations. "This is a courtroom, governed by the law that you so arrogantly disregarded when you decided to murder innocent people." Hale's defense strategy, to the extent that it could be called one, seemed less focused on exoneration and more on amplifying his cult's message. Legal analysts later noted that Hale likely knew there was no escape from the overwhelming mountain of evidence against him. His real aim was theatrical, a performance designed to solidify his role as a martyr in the eyes of his followers rather than secure his freedom. The victims speak. Alongside the evidence detailing Hale's disrepair of the law were the heart-wrenching stories shared by victims and families of those who had perished. Mothers wept openly at the witness stand, clutching photos of sons and daughters who had boarded the subway that fateful morning, never to return. One woman, whose husband of 30 years had died shielding her from the first whiff of the VX gas, bared her soul to the courtroom, recounting every agonizing second of their final moments together. Hale stared at her through it all, unperturbed, his expression steely, as if already calculating his rebuttal. "This wasn't an act of war," the woman said, her voice breaking. "Marcus Hale didn't do this to change the world. He did it because he enjoys seeing people suffer. This is not a man with a cause. This is a monster." Children of the victims, now too old to cry but too young to fully understand the void that had been left behind, attended the trial in silent solidarity. They formed a wall of resilience in the gallery, their presence a reminder of the lives torn apart by Hale's ideology and the enduring strength of those left in its wake. The verdict. After nearly 3 months of grueling testimonies, graphic evidence, and painstaking legal arguments, the case finally drew to a close. The jurors, sequestered for the entire trial, were visibly shaken as they returned to their seats to deliver the verdict. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Hale, guilty," the forewoman declared, her voice cracking slightly as she spoke the words that echoed through the packed gallery. "Guilty on all counts. 2,512 charges of murder, conspiracy to commit terrorism, use of weapons of mass destruction, and numerous violations of international arms treaties." Hale sat motionless, staring ahead as though he hadn't heard a single word. The sentencing came as no surprise. Chief Justice Morales delivered the harshest penalty available under U.S. law: death. Her words, carefully chosen, embodied not only justice but a collective reckoning. You, Mr. Hale, took it upon yourself to inflict unbearable harm on the citizens of this nation. Your belief that this makes you a martyr is a fallacy. You are not a savior, you are not misunderstood, you are a murderer, plain and simple, and justice has been served. The fallout. The trial of Marcus Hale was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a national reckoning with the vulnerabilities that allowed extremists to fester in the shadows and prey upon society's most broken members. For some, justice was a hollow word, a symbolic victory in the face of irreparable loss. For others, the sight of Hale being led away in shackles was a moment of closure that finally allowed them to breathe again. Outside the courthouse, the world watched as Hale's trial shifted from a spectacle of terror to a study in courage. Survivors who had once been silenced by fear found their voices. Families who once grieved in solitude embraced one another in solidarity. Despite Hale's attempts to twist the trial into a platform for his rhetoric, it became a beacon of resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the rule of law and the strength of the human spirit could prevail. The sentence and the costly lessons Marcus Hale, the self-proclaimed prophet of purification, once confidently believed his ideology of destruction would reshape the world. But as he sat in a courtroom shackled and motionless, he couldn't ignore the weight of his actions. Hale had faced judgment, not as a savior as he fancied himself, but as a symbol of unchecked extremism, manipulation, and terror. On that day the voice of justice resonated louder than his cell-bound rhetoric ever could. When the sentence of death was handed down, there were no gasps, no eruptions, no sense of surprise in the courtroom. It was expected, inevitable even, but it was also bittersweet. Justice may have delivered its verdict, but the pain and loss Hale had inflicted could never truly be undone. The families of the victims, survivors, and a nation left scarred by his crimes could do nothing but live with the weight of those memories. For Hale, one truth rang clear. Though his life would end, the collective trauma he caused would linger indefinitely. The sentence that spoke for a nation. Chief Justice Eleanor Morales, presiding with her characteristic strength and compassion, spoke her final words to Hale during sentencing. Her tone was firm but devoid of malice, as if reiterating a simple fact for history to record. You believed you were above the law, immune to the cries of those you harmed in the pursuit of your deluded mission. But know this, Mr. Hale, you are not a martyr. You are not history's savior, and history will remember you not as a visionary, but as a murderer. For your crimes, for your arrogance, and for the devastation you unleashed, you will pay the ultimate price. Even as Morales delivered this statement, Hale sat expressionless. His unnervingly calm demeanor reinforced a chilling truth about his character. He never saw himself as guilty, only misunderstood and persecuted. But while the sentence marked an official end to his reign of terror, it also forced a reckoning, a need to confront the larger questions at the heart of Hale's rise to power. The aftermath, a shattered rebuild. For the families directly impacted by the attack, the sentence was like closing a door on a burning house. It symbolized an end, but did little to extinguish the fire. Many in attendance openly admitted that no legal resolution could restore the lives lost or repair the fractured futures they envisioned before Hale's ideology seeped into the world. A father who had lost his daughter described the sentence as a momentary relief but no real solace. A survivor scarred by chemical burns testified, "I'm glad to see him taken down, but it doesn't mean I'll stop waking up screaming in the middle of the night." Across New York City, opinion on the sentence was loud and interconnected. Headlines like, "Death for the subway prophet, is it justice or retaliation?" reflected America's conflicted stance about capital punishment, especially when leveled against figures like Hale, who thrived on martyrdom. For some, his execution was an assertion of humanity's intolerance for terrorism. For others, it risked feeding the legend he tried to build for himself, a martyr who, in death, could still inspire disillusioned followers. Both possibilities would keep officials and communities on edge for years. New York saw visible societal changes. The subway, which Hale had dehumanized into a chilling battleground, underwent extensive safety upgrades in the years following the attack. Chemical detection sensors were installed at high traffic stations, emergency response evacuation plans were updated to deal with mass exposure scenarios, and NYPD reinforcements patrolled underground routes around the clock. It was both a practical response and a psychological reassurance to a city still mourning. Lessons in fragility. The case of Marcus Hale wasn't just another chapter in America's long confrontation with extremism. It forced the nation to examine deeper, uncomfortable truths. How could someone like Hale rise so undetected, so unchecked? How could normal people, teachers, parents, veterans, be twisted into instruments of terrorism without greater societal intervention? Experts on extremism stressed how Hale had masterfully exploited cracks in American systems. He preyed on disenfranchisement, loneliness and anger, emotions that festered in a world increasingly polarized and divided. For Hale's followers, it wasn't the man himself that initially drew them in, but the sense of belonging he offered in their darkest hours. A security expert testified during the sentencing, "What Hale provided wasn't just doctrine, it was companionship in despair. It makes us question not just national security but social resilience." The discoveries at Hale's hidden chemical lab in Pennsylvania sent another shockwave through the national psyche. It exposed glaring vulnerabilities in the regulation of dangerous chemicals and in the monitoring of fringe groups operating under the guise of activism. In response, the federal government began implementing tighter restrictions on chemical sales and research materials. Agricultural chemicals like organophosphates, which were harmless in farming and lethal in warfare, could no longer be purchased without strict oversight. The change was swift, comprehensive, and overdue. Political leaders acknowledged a lesson in leadership as well. Hale had surfaced during a time of growing political divisiveness and social isolation, and his ideology flourished in the gaps left by eroding community trust. Many policymakers called on Congress to address not only the tactical aspects of preventing terrorism but the socio-economic conditions that provided fertile ground for cults like the Purifiers. Cautionary reflections for future generations. Beyond practical policy changes, Hale's rise and fall became a defining cautionary tale for generations to come. His ability to manipulate and weaponize human suffering was a stark reminder of the power unchecked charisma and ideology could wield over individuals and societies alike. Educational programs began addressing the dangers of cults, the red flags of radicalization, and the importance of psychological resilience in overcoming feelings of alienation. In documentaries, classrooms, and even congressional hearings, historians and sociologists likened Hale's influence to a disease. It spread subtle at first, unnoticed until it had infected enough to cause catastrophic harm. While Hale's legacy would always remain dark, the lessons derived from dismantling his cult offered glimpses of hope. For every life destroyed, thousands more resolved to prevent future tragedies through vigilance, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to community, confronting humanity's duality. At its core, the story of Marcus Hale wasn't just about terror or manipulation, it was about humanity's duality. It was a harsh study of how despair could drive people to embrace destruction, but also a testament to resilience and the human spirit's capacity to endure. Hale's cult highlighted humanity's darkest vulnerabilities, but the survivors, victims, and even the investigators who brought him down showed the world its greatest strength, the ability to fight back. Even as his name faded from headlines and textbooks, Hale's crimes served as a constant reminder of society's collective responsibility to guard against the forces of hatred, isolation, and extremism. His story left a scar across America's soul, but in that scar lay the resolve to ensure nothing like it would happen again. Moving on, but remembering forever. Even as Marcus Hale awaited his fate in a maximum security prison, the world he sought to destroy continued turning. Families rebuilt, scarred but not broken. Survivors reclaimed their identities, remaining cautious yet determined to re-engage with the world. And New Yorkers, in true New York fashion, kept riding the subway, defiantly proving that no ideology, no matter how twisted, could shatter the resilience of a city that had endured and risen from the ashes of tragedy time and time again. In the years that followed, Hale's story turned into a symbol, not of his triumph, but of how extreme ideology could be defeated by justice, reason, and humanity. His ultimate sentence wasn't just death, it was irrelevance. History would not remember him as a prophet or visionary but as what he truly was, a villain, and in his wake, America emerged not unscathed but undeniably stronger. The long-term consequences. The subway attacks of 1997 left an indelible mark on the psyche of not just New York City, but the entire nation. It was an event that changed the way Americans conceptualized security, community, and even their relationship with the mundane routines of daily life. The long-term effects were more than scars. They were seismic shifts in culture, policy, and identity, reverberating for decades into the future. For the survivors, the families of the victims, and even those who simply bore witness from afar, the impacts were deeply personal and universally transformative. The attacks reshaped how Americans viewed the fragile balance between safety and freedom while exposing their vulnerabilities in the face of emerging threats. The emotional wounds. The emotional toll of the attack was profound and enduring. For many survivors, stepping onto a subway after that day became an act of courage. Every shrill screech of the metal wheels on tracks or whiff of an unidentifiable smell could trigger a memory they'd tried desperately to bury. Some were haunted by nightmares of gas filling confined spaces, of bodies collapsing around them, of their own lungs tightening as if to suffocate them long after the danger had passed. Others experienced survivors' guilt, crushed under the weight of being among the lucky few who had escaped unharmed while friends, co-workers, or strangers standing just feet away had lost their lives. For families who lost loved ones, the grief was relentless. The morning of the attack repeated in their minds with cruel clarity, mundane moments that seemed so ordinary until they became extraordinary in the worst possible way. A hurried goodbye at the door, a kiss on the cheek at the breakfast table, a quick "don't miss your train" shouted to someone as they left the house. Entire futures were redefined by the absence of those who never returned home, and for those left behind, every milestone, birthdays, holidays, graduations, was a stark reminder of what had been forever taken from them. Public therapy sessions and trauma counseling initiatives became widespread in New York City in the months after the attack. Support groups formed spontaneously, offering survivors and families a rare solace in shared understanding. Yet many victims felt their pain was something the rest of the country couldn't truly comprehend, isolated even as they were surrounded by sympathy. One survivor, a young office worker who had been trapped in a subway car during the attack, later said, "I walked out of the station alive, but a part of me never left that train. I was suffocating then, and sometimes I still feel like I'm suffocating now." Her words echoed the sentiments of countless others who had lived through the horrors of that day. The loss of mundane trust. One of the cruelest effects of the subway attack was how it transformed the image of everyday life. Before that Monday morning in 1997, riding the subway was an unremarkable part of life for millions of New Yorkers. A crowded train during rush hour was an inconvenience, not a breeding ground for terror. But after the attacks, the ordinary became extraordinary. An ordinary backpack became suspicious, an ordinary delay became unsettling, and strangers sharing a train car became potential threats. Trust in the mundane was shattered. For months after the attacks, subway ridership dropped drastically. Parents refused to let their children use public transportation, opting instead for carpooling despite the impossibility of navigating the city's congested streets. Office workers altered their commutes, often adding hours to their day so they could avoid the subway altogether. Tourists, a lifeblood of New York's economy, approached the city's iconic transit system with hesitation, if they rode it at all. Even as the years passed and the immediate fears began to subside, the scars remained. Many subway riders would casually glance at other passengers' bags, their gazes linger longer on fellow commuters who seemed uneasy or out of place. It was a reminder that while the city moved forward, it would never fully shake off the shadow of that fateful day. The transformation of public security. The subway attacks became a watershed moment in American history, not just for their horrifying immediacy, but for their implications on security and public policy. In the wake of the tragedy, both city and federal governments scrambled to address the glaring vulnerabilities that Hale and his cult had so brazenly exposed. The era of tight, visible public security had arrived. New York City invested millions of dollars in upgrading the subway system with new layers of protection. Chemical detectors were installed at sensitive locations throughout major transit hubs, capable of identifying nerve agents and other toxic substances within seconds. Cameras, once sporadically placed, now monitored nearly every corner of the subway system, providing real-time surveillance across the extensive network of tunnels and stations. Emergency drills, which had often focused on fire safety or train malfunctions, were overhauled to address scenarios involving chemical weapons or large-scale terrorist attacks. First responders, including paramedics, NYPD, and firefighters, underwent specialized training in chemical decontamination and mass casualty management. The city became synonymous with resiliency, but also vigilance. On a national level, Congress introduced a wave of reforms in the regulation of dangerous chemicals that could be weaponized. The purchase of organophosphates, the key ingredient in the VX nerve agent used in the attack, was more heavily scrutinized than ever before. Industrial and agricultural sectors faced tighter oversight in their supply chains, while penalties for black market chemical transactions escalated dramatically. Marcus Hale's Pennsylvania lab became a grim touchstone for what could happen when fractured regulations collided with calculated extremism. The shift in national psyche. Americans in the late 90s were forced to reckon with a chilling reality. Domestic terrorism didn't have to wear the face of a foreign enemy. It could arise from within, born of bitterness, despair, and disillusionment. The subway attacks shattered the illusion that terrorism was something that came from elsewhere. It revealed that the seeds of destruction could be planted in the cracks of society itself, among the isolated, the angry, and the desperate looking for purpose. This awakening wasn't limited to security measures. It sparked debates about the larger cultural and socio-economic factors that allowed figures like Marcus Hale to thrive. Policy experts emphasized the need for grassroots programs designed to rebuild fractured communities and detect early signs of radicalization. Psychologists pushed for greater mental health support, particularly for those who felt alienated or discarded by the system. Faith leaders, educators, and social workers formed partnerships to strengthen community ties and reduce the influence of extremist ideas in vulnerable populations. A legacy of resilience. Yet, for all the tears shed and fears stoked, the story of the subway attacks was also one of resilience. Nothing defines New York City better than its ability to absorb the blows of history and stand taller in their aftermath. The city that survived 9/11's, devastating fires, financial collapses, and hurricanes continued to move forward, scarred but steadfast. Subway ridership eventually returned to normal levels, albeit with a sharper awareness among passengers. Public art installations in stations began to memorialize those lost in the attack, blending sorrow with pride as the city honored their memories. Signs reading, "If you see something, say something," became more than just warnings. They evolved into a creed of collective responsibility, a symbol of a city watching out for itself. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the attack, however, is the unity it inspired. While Marcus Hale sought to divide, his actions ultimately pulled people together. Strangers who survived the attack stayed connected for years, forged by their shared pain. Communities rallied to support one another, raising money for victims' families, holding remembrance ceremonies, and refusing to let the narrative of terror eclipse the spirit of hope. The lesson in the pain. The subway attacks of 1997 will forever be remembered as a dark chapter in American history, but they also revealed the deep well of resilience inherent in individuals and communities. They were a sobering reminder of the fragile nature of trust and safety, but they also underscored the strength of human connection, the value of vigilance, and the necessity of addressing societal fractures before they widen into chasms. As one victim's relative said on the 10th anniversary of the tragedy, standing at a newly unveiled memorial, "We lost so much that day, more than I'll ever really be able to say. But what we didn't lose, what they couldn't take from us, was the will to carry on and to do better. We owe it to those who didn't make it back to live as boldly and as beautifully as possible." The wake-up call. The story of the subway attacks in 1997, and the monstrous ideology behind them, is more than just an episode of terror. It is a haunting reflection of society's darkest vulnerabilities, and a grim testament to how easily fractured individuals can fall prey to hatred and manipulation. But it is also a powerful, enduring warning, one that calls on humanity to recognize its fragility, confront its apathy, and find strength in vigilance and compassion. This wake-up call echoes across decades, leaving a deep, jagged scar etched into both America's memory and its identity. It is a reminder that we cannot afford to ignore the warning signs of extremism and division lurking in the margins of our society. The paths that led Marcus Hale and his cult to weaponize fear, despair, and isolation began on familiar grounds, within neighborhoods, on college campuses, and online forums where discontent quietly brewed. But the escalation of those grievances into mass tragedy was no accident. It thrived on humanity's blind spots, on society's tendency to look the other way until the damage was done. The danger of complacency. The subway attacks exposed a harsh truth. Complacency can be dangerous, even deadly. Before Hale, the purifiers were dismissed as just another small, attention-seeking fringe group. Their extremist rhetoric, though unsettling, largely flew under the radar. Law enforcement agencies, spread thin by the demands of the era, couldn't justify allocating full-scale investigations to a cult operating quietly in remote Pennsylvania. Neighbors of their chemical lab, suspicious of strange late-night activity, chalked it up to harmless industrial work rather than sounding the alarm. By the time Marcus Hale and his followers executed their apocalyptic vision, it was too late to undo the horrors that meticulous planning and unchecked radicalization had unleashed on the world. The gas released that day didn't just poison an unsuspecting subway car, it symbolized how small embers of hate and discontent can grow into uncontrollable infernos if left unchecked. The wake-up call reminds us of an uncomfortable truth. Extremism doesn't emerge overnight. It festers. It grows. And it often begins in spaces that feel unthreatening. Late-night forums, whispered conversations, isolated compounds shrouded in secrecy. Hale didn't create the purifiers from nothing. He harnessed the feelings of abandonment, failure, and disenfranchisement that lived like dormant seeds in the hearts of his followers. The wake-up call beckons society to ask, how many other Hales are out there, slowly gathering shadowed armies beneath our noses? Compassion, the antidote to extremism. While the subway attacks were born of hatred and despair, they also reveal the transformative power of empathy, an antidote to the very poison Hale spread. Hale's genius as a cult leader lay in his understanding of pain, how it isolates, how it weakens defenses, how it erodes a person's ability to resist destructive ideas. His manipulation fed off loneliness, reeling in veterans who felt discarded by the country they served, mothers who felt invisible in a system that prioritized profit over people, and young minds longing for clarity in a chaotic world. This tragedy was a powerful reminder that the key to fighting radicalization is to meet despair with compassion. If Hale's followers had been reached before him, through supportive community programs, accessible mental health resources, or strong relationships, they might have avoided his grasp. The wake-up call reminds society to be vigilant, not just against terrorists or extremists, but against despair itself, the festering cracks in the human experience that can lead someone down dark roads. Supporting those who feel lost before extremism reaches them isn't just an idealistic notion, it's a pragmatic shield. Robust mental health resources, better support for veterans, educational opportunities for at-risk youth, and community cohesion aren't luxuries. They are the barriers standing between vulnerable individuals and the manipulation of figures like Hale. The role of technology and radicalization. The subway attacks also foreshadowed the changing landscape of radicalization in the modern world. Even in the 1990s, Hale used fledgling technology to spread his ideology. His sermons, filmed and distributed on videotapes, found their way into hands desperate for answers and validation. The internet, then in its infancy, served as fertile ground for Hale's discontented recruits, many of whom found themselves drawn to forums promoting conspiracy theories and anti-government rhetoric. Fast forward to today, and the wake-up call becomes even more urgent. The internet, now vast and omnipresent, has become both a tool for connection and a breeding ground for extremism. Algorithms funnel vulnerable individuals into echo chambers, birthing communities where dangerous ideas flourish unchecked. Lone wolves can receive instruction from extremist manifestos with a few clicks of a button. Recruitment no longer requires a leader as charismatic as Hale, only a convincing narrative, wrapped in persuasive half-truths, amplified across limitless digital spaces. The wake-up call demands that we confront this evolving reality. It demands that tech companies, educators, and policymakers treat online radicalization as the grave threat that it is. Preventative measures are not merely about content moderation, they must include digital literacy programs, tools to counteract harmful ideologies, and international cooperation to stave off modern extremism's global tentacles. A call for collective vigilance. No single person, community, or institution could have entirely stopped Marcus Hale, but his rise underscores the critical importance of collective vigilance. The warning signs of the purifiers weren't invisible, they were ignored. Their gradual escalation served as a cautionary tale of what happens when fractured communities and social institutions fail to take threats seriously. The wake-up call reminds us all of our shared responsibility to prevent history from repeating itself. Local communities, law enforcement agencies, businesses, and religious organizations must work in tandem to identify and counter behaviors that signal radicalization. It doesn't take invasive policing or authoritarian surveillance, it takes connection, awareness, and the courage to speak up when something feels wrong. every person has a role to play. The vigilant citizen who spots troubling behavior in their neighborhood, the teacher who notices a student gradually withdrawing and growing angrier at the world. The friend who hears extremist rhetoric and refuses to stay silent. The wake-up call demands courage, to push past apathy, to err on the side of action instead of ignorance, and to protect one another from the darkness that can creep into vulnerable hearts. The reminder of resilience. Just as this wake-up call reminds us of evil's insidious reach, it also reminds us of humanity's unmatched strength. For every Hale who worked in the shadows to spread poison, there were countless others who fought back with light. The first responders in the subways who risked their lives without hesitation. The investigators who tracked Hale's every move, unwilling to let his poison go unanswered. The survivors who rebuilt their lives from ashes and went on to share their stories, ensuring the world never forgets. Hale's ideology ultimately failed, not because of his death sentence, but because the victims and the city he tried to destroy found the strength to move forward. His cult fractured, his followers were scattered and rehabilitated, and his doctrine carried no future beyond the scars it left behind, legacies of hope and action. The tragedy of the subway attacks wasn't just a loss of lives, it was a loss of innocence, of trust, and of the comforting idea that we are insulated from cruelty. But in the wake of that loss came resolve. The wake-up call demands that we not look away. It demands that we build stronger systems of support, invest in our communities, and never shy away from combating the forces that seek to divide us. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that every small act matters. Every word of kindness, every moment of compassion, and every effort to build bridges rather than walls is a step toward ensuring that figures like Marcus Hale can never rise to destroy again. As one prosecutor said during Hale's sentencing, the lesson of this trial isn't just that justice can be done, it's that this must never happen again. It's about choosing connection over division, hope over fear, and vigilance over silence.